Employees impacted by the reduction in force notice will be placed on administrative leave starting March 21st. Now, here in Washington, the impacts could be major. According to the Department of Education, our state was budgeted to get almost $1 billion in funding for elementary and secondary level programs this year. They also added an additional $500 million in post-secondary education funding. That combined with a half dozen other programs, the amount of federal education funding budgeted for Washington totaled more than $2 billion. The mass layoffs could also impact staffing levels, program options, school lunches, and more. We wanted to hear about possible impacts from the top right here in our state. So joining us live is State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Chris Reykdal. Good morning to you, Chris. Thanks for being with us. Let's get right to it here. What was your reaction to these layoffs, and which impacts did you immediately brace for here in our state?
Well, nothing surprising about this. This was part of that larger Project 2025 that was crafted for this administration. I think what's interesting is the votes probably aren't there in Congress to officially abolish the department. So the Trump administration is just doing it by total attrition. They're just going to wipe out staffing levels and supports for the states and school districts. So they'll de facto destroy the Department of Ed, even if Congress doesn't have the votes to officially do it. What would be most impactful, I think, are if there are big hits to financial aid on the higher ed side. And then in our area, the K-12 space, we'll be looking very, very closely at whether they're going to pull money away from high poverty schools. This will impact our rural districts the most. And then the second place, which I'm hopeful they won't touch, but we're very much on guard, is if they start pulling money away to support students with disabilities.
Yeah. What could be on the chopping block due to these here in Washington, due to these layoffs in the Capitol?
Yeah, again, if it gets bad enough, it'll be service levels. We'll call them for a civil rights investigation, and they'll say we don't have the staffing to do all the caseloads. So people need to remember that the U.S. Department of Ed was originally designed to enforce all the civil rights laws in our school system. Equitable access for students of color, students with disabilities, students in high poverty communities. If their staffing levels are decimated, there won't be phones there answered. Like, we won't get the supports that we need. Therefore, enforcement is a risk. And I think if you're kind of zooming out of this and looking big picture, you'd say maybe the U.S. Department of Education is overstating this whole idea. We're going to give power back to the states. We have all that already in terms of curriculum decisions and how we deploy in our schools. We have that control in the states. What they're there to do is a backstop for civil rights. So if they really do dismantle it, I think you're going to see a big push to resegregate schools again. Certainly to privatize schools with voucher programs. That's part of the bigger plan of theirs. The impacts in our state will really be about whether the money stops flowing to support those civil rights programs.
Yeah, and as I understand, a lot of that money flows to special education in our state. So what's your big message to parents who say they're worried about cuts to special ed here?
Well, my message is keep the pressure on your congressional delegation, both sides of the aisle. It doesn't need to be partisan in this case. Congress needs to say, hey, listen, we're the ones who write the checks, not the president. So if Congress maintains the investments, the money will keep flowing. And the second thing is, remember that 80% of special education is funded right here in our state legislature, 20% from the federal government. So we're in our own budget challenge in our state, but we should lean into an expectation that our lawmakers here in Washington state continue their commitment and growing their commitment to special ed services.
The president says he wants to give power of education back to the states. So does that give you more power ultimately? And is that a good idea looking down the line here?
Well, again, it's complicated because we already have that. Curriculum decisions, learning standards, it's all already in the states. What the federal government has done is enforce civil rights. They've certainly got a testing regime that Congress passed that forces certain standardized tests on us. So if they're willing to give us all of that control, like, I'm all in. Let's have this conversation about real flexibility. But if it's just to privatize the system, if it's just to push their sort of agenda on school vouchers, but then still have all of the expectations for data reporting and all of the expectations for testing in the public schools that aren't applicable to the private schools, well, that's just ugly. That's just partisan political ugliness out of Washington, D.C. So I don't know that anyone believes the rhetoric about returning control back to the states. We have most of that already. If they give us the last pieces of it, I suppose that's good. But the investment is what matters most.
Well, you mentioned student vouchers, and I know we're early into this Trump administration, but how does our state's approach to education compare with the Trump administration's approach to education? Are there key differences or similarities here?
Yeah, there are big differences, and that's why I say the states already have this control. We get to decide whether we're going to have voucher schemes or not, and this state has chosen not to. We fund our public schools. We have a small charter school network. Private schools are a tremendous option for families if they want it, but taxpayers in the state aren't asked to foot the bill for private education choices. The Trump administration wants that to be universal. They want to give lots of taxpayer money to individuals to send their money to religious, faith-based institutions. So there's big values differences. And again, I'm back to their point. If they're saying we're giving control back to the states, well, let Washington State run its education system the way we want. But if this is really about sending money to us under a condition that we do it exactly the way President Trump wants, well, we'll fight that in the courts, and we'll resist that because it steps all over states' rights.
You mentioned we do have budget issues here in our school districts in the state. Lots of school districts in the red right now, and I guess the one we talk about the most is Marysville. They're having a budget crisis as well. But what does this mean if federal funding goes away and the Department of Education goes away for districts like Marysville?
Yeah, our state has, thankfully, one of the lowest dependencies on federal money. It's about 7% of the average school district's budget comes from federal sources. What's important to remember is it really varies a lot. In rural communities, it can be 20 or 30%, and in some of our urban districts, it's 2 or 3%. So the impacts will be really disparate depending on where you live and the level of high poverty in your community. What I would say is most of our districts are stable right now. They don't need another financial hit. Inflation has eaten them alive. The cost of some of their services has certainly gone up faster than their revenue. Most of that responsibility is back on our legislature, but it will not help if our school districts lose money as a result of this federal regime, because again, it's targeted for meals. It's targeted to support students with disabilities, students who are experiencing a lot of poverty. Federal dollars tend to have a civil right element to them, and if districts don't get the money, but they still have the legal obligation, which they should, then they're going to find themselves in much bigger financial distress.
You mentioned parents should call their local legislator. What are you hearing from lawmakers in a fight against the abolishment of the Department of Education? How prepared is Washington to push back against these policies there in D.C.?
I don't hear much. That's what's a little bit troubling. I mean, in the 50 states, most of their legislatures are in session right now. So lawmakers at the state level, they're really focused on their own states right now. So we turn to our congressional delegation, and in our state, obviously, that's 10 Democrats and 2 Republicans. And so we reach out to all of them and say, please push back on this. I think the Democrats feel awfully helpless, given that Congress is yielding so much power to President Trump and Elon Musk, quite frankly. And I think it's a complicated time where the separation of powers typically is a check and balance system. Congress doesn't let presidents, run over the executive branch's agencies, because Congress is supposed to set those budgets. They're supposed to be the ones that make the investment. So it's a strange time. I'd like to see a lot more pushback from our federal delegation and a lot more commitment, again, Democrats and Republicans, to bringing more of Washington's money back home. We subsidize the rest of the country by over $22 billion a year in our federal income tax. That's the amount of money that we don't get back in a 50-50 where we pay in and we get back. If there's a bipartisan thing here, it's congressional Republicans and congressional Democrats from our state changing federal funding formulas in Washington, D.C. to get Washingtonians' money back in our hands.
All right, we will see how this all plays out. Superintendent of Public Instruction, Chris Reykdal, thanks for being with us this morning.
Thanks.